trunk or treat and the efforts that were put forth. We have contacts, 18 contacts were made, and we have pictures that we took of them, their family. We have invitation. Next Sunday is what? Friends and Family Day. So we have in the annex over there, we have their family's pictures. We have the invitation to our Friends and Family Day, and we have their address. And there's not but maybe 12 of those addresses or those cards still there. So really need for you folks to go and pick up one and go make that visit. Pick up more than one. But be sure and get one for Faye, one for Wayne. We got enough people that if everybody would just get involved, we could get this all done. Folks, you could pick it up and you could make a visit this afternoon and it'd be over and done. And what else are you going to do on a Sunday afternoon besides go home and take a nap? Okay? So all that is over there, and we encourage you to do that, to pick that up, get that in their hands, because we would like to have as many of those folks that were here for our trunk or treat as we possibly can. And there's nothing better than what kind of an invitation? Personal invitation. Hi, Faye. Yes, and Wayne and Faye and Laura. Laura's back there. She's hanging out with Glenda this morning. Huh? I thought it was pretty good. Yeah. Hey, you opened that up. You knew we was going to step through that door, Faye. Anyway, yeah, and so Chris Barker, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, Chris Barker was one of the firemen that was here with the Fruitvale Fire Department when the building burnt and positioned himself somewhere in one of these hallways. And so then he is now fire chief, I think, of the volunteer fire department. And he's spent 71 days in the hospital. He's had 2 strokes. And so don't know just exactly what the outlook is for him as far as going back to work and so forth. He works in the oil field, and so he would be gone 10 days or whatever and back. So in those 71 days, he hasn't worked. So Wayne and Faye have been able to help them and met them, and they've got some groceries and stuff. And so we will continue to be mindful of Chris Barker and the situation that he's in, and his wife and their family. So someone else to add to our prayer list. And we will need you to, if you can, pick up cards today. We have cards. We're going to send encouragement cards to Doug Flowers at the Home of Recovery. And then we've got, who else, Nancy? Help me out. Yes, Keith Fincher, who received the heart transplant early Wednesday morning, and then Brendan and Chelsea Morgan, and so we'll send cards to them. So please find your way to our evangelism room and pick up the cards and fill those out. And, take them home with you this afternoon and bring them back this evening. And, just think what a wonderful afternoon you can have. Go home and eat lunch, or go out to eat lunch, whatever your plans are. Pick up trunk or treat contact, go make a visit, go home, fill out the cards, bring them back, and then we'll be everybody involved and everybody participating, and we'll all be encouraged. And folks, I don't know who was giddier Thursday night when I got the phone call and the news that Doug Flowers was going to be baptized. Um, I don't know who was happier, me or one of the elders from Mount Vernon. But it was just, one of those things. And talking with him, he said over the last 2 or 3 weeks, Doug Flowers had been making comments in their Bible class at Mount Vernon. And he said, I knew then, he said, this guy's he's going to either make a decision. And he said his comments were spot on. Said he wasn't an ignorant person biblically. And he said, but I was just so afraid that we were going to get him sober and not be able to have a part in him being saved. But that took care of itself Thursday night. So we need to be grateful and thankful for the work at the home of recovery. Not only is it getting folks or helping to get folks off of the addiction to alcohol and drugs, but they're also doing a good work spiritually. Okay, we're in Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. Philippians 1 and 12 is where we'll pick up this morning. Paul writing to the church at Philippi. And do any of y'all remember your homework assignment from last Sunday to this Sunday? I'm going to suggest, since nobody remembered it, nobody did it. Okay, how many years from the time Paul was at Philippi in Acts 16 till he wrote the letter to the church at Philippi? How many years? Somewhere between 10 and 12 years. In that 12. And you can get some depending on when you date that second missionary journey. If you put that date earlier, then you're going to have probably a longer period there. But I would say anywhere between 10 and 12 years, and maybe even stretching it out, we could go as far as maybe 15. Then we are in the ballpark of how long they had been separated. And I think what's interesting to this is when Paul makes the comments that we'll see throughout the book where he says, you contributed once and again to my needs. You contributed. Chapter 4, 10 through 14 will bring that up, as well as other places. But these folks, once Paul had been instrumental in helping the jailer and Lydia and the congregation to get established there, then they were a congregation that was working with Paul throughout all of his efforts to preach the gospel. So now, verse 12, Paul writes now, but I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord have become confident by my chains and are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So notice in 12 through 14, the things that Paul is identifying by his imprisonment. And we know, as we refer to it as an imprisonment, what was it actually? He was a prisoner of Rome, but he wasn't confined to what we might think of as a jail cell. It was house arrest. We closed out Acts 28, and we noticed that Paul, and this is how Luke ends that book, he says, and Paul was 2 years in his own rented house. So there he was for 2 years, and apparently they were 2 years longing and waiting for the Jews to come up from Jerusalem to substantiate the charges, and after 2 years they released Paul. But in this 2-year period, Paul is going to write what we refer to as the blank epistles, prison epistles, writing from a rented house in the city of Rome. And Paul is now going to be writing to the church at Philippi. And he says, now I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Now, what things happened? He says the things that have happened to me. Folks, we don't have time to go back and rehearse all of this because it starts in Acts 21 and doesn't cease until we get to Acts 28. That's what he's referencing. This is all of the things that have happened to me. So we're talking about 7 or 8 chapters of the book of Acts wherein Paul is referencing these are the things that happened to me. The things that happened is he was falsely charged. He was confined to jail in Caesarea for 2 years. Then he makes the journey to Rome. He's now going to be in Rome for a period of 2 years, as we know. But it's in Acts 21 through chapter 28 that these things are recorded. So now he says, I want you to know these things which have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. This word furtherance here means a pioneer advance. It's one paving a way. Yes, Dale? Sure. Yeah.
What Paul was doing. And so people knew about why he was there.
Right. And so he's there, and it's going to be leading to the furtherance or the pioneer advance. W.E. Vine, in his study on this, says this is a pioneer, represents a pioneer cutting his way through brushwood. So when you think about this imagery now, it's as if Paul's imprisonment, which led to the furtherance, he was hacking his way, that image, through the world or through that culture. And that's what the gospel was doing. It was just carving away, making a path. And so when we think about what Paul says as he's talking concerning the things which befell him and the things that he had to suffer, he says it's turned out to the furtherance. I think what's interesting in all of this, this book, we don't see Paul moaning, complaining. He talks about, how happy he is. We're either going to notice that he's even happy that individuals who are not pro-Paul are preaching Christ and the gospel is being spread. Now, they weren't preaching a false doctrine. That's not what he was applauding. They were preaching whom? Christ. Their motives weren't sincere, but he says, I rejoice that this is taking place. Paul had such a fantastic attitude toward all of this, and I think we tap into it when we get a little further on into the book, and he says, now I have learned to be content. Content. What's content or contentment? What's it mean? I'm content. Peace inside. I'm satisfied. He said, I've learned whether I'm without or whether I'm flourishing, I've learned to be content. And so then he picks up writing to Timothy, and he tells Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain. Now, that's one of the things that our society, perhaps, I don't know that it's anymore, but it just maybe because of, as Dale brought up, the likelihood that everything's going to get spread abroad and everything's going to get shared, social media can be a good thing, but it can also be what? Bad. And I'm like a lot of folks on social media. I don't care what you ate for lunch today. I could really care less. But people share so much. There's nothing really that's of any kind of a private matter or anything anymore. And so, but Paul says, I've learned contentment. He learned how to be satisfied. And how do you learn to be satisfied? What does that imply? Huh? Okay. Okay. But for me to learn to be satisfied, that means I've done without. I can't learn to be satisfied with what I have if I don't have some things to compare, to do without, or to be in great abundance of things. Paul says, I've learned to be satisfied with where I am in life, what is happening to me. I've learned to be satisfied. You know, and it's kind of like developing patience. What do you got to go through to develop patience? Yeah, I've never had to experience patience when everything was going good. Patience comes by what? Trials, difficulties. And so people want the patience of Job. Well, if I'm going to have the patience of Job, I've got to experience what? What Job experienced. Well, who wants that? No one wants that. That's why Job is held up for us in such a great way as an example. So now he says, I have, it's actually happened to the furtherance of the gospel. The gospel was being spread. And I think Paul understood this prior to coming to Rome, because that's why he wanted to go to Rome. I need to go to Rome, because he knew that the possibility for the furtherance of the gospel would just be that which would be benefited greater being in Rome than in some other place. Now, in some other place, he might have met people that came from Rome, or he might meet someone that's what? Going to Rome. But Rome was the Mecca of the world. And Paul said, that's where I want to go, because I want to be able to share the gospel. Because if I can share the gospel there and people can have the opportunity to obey the gospel, then where will they go from Rome? To the world. They're going to go to the world. So he was grateful for the furtherance of the gospel. Now notice, so that it had become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. It's known that my chains are in Christ. He was technically a prisoner of Rome, but he was really in prison because of whom? Christ. I'm in prison because of Christ. Particularly, he was in prison. If you go back and you look at those chapters I mentioned, Acts 21 through 28, Paul was in prison in Rome because he taught what? The gospel, which included what? Who did that include? Who did that include? What group of people? Now remember, who was instrumental in imprisoning Paul to begin with? The Jews. What message did Paul teach that got the Jews all stirred up? Christianity. To whom? Gentiles. This is what stirred them up. Christ preached to Gentiles the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, so they'd have the opportunity to obey the gospel. Having done that, you remember they seized Paul and they were beating him, and so now the Roman general, whatever he was, he comes down and now he rescues Paul. And so then the plot becomes known that they're going to try to kill Paul. So they ship him to Caesarea. All of this is working to the furtherance of the gospel. And Paul, as he's sitting there in Rome and he's looking back on the events that unfolded, he could see God's providential work.
That was in the group was the one that told him that they were going to kill him? Because somehow
Yes.
he thought
Yes.
Paul.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and he got news of that, and so he went and told the Roman official, and then the Roman official came, and he found out they had this plan hatched where they were going to be moving him, and they were going to be lying in wait, and then as he came by, they were going to attack him, and so that became known, and he revealed that to the Romans, and then they came and investigated, and so then they took Paul to Caesarea, and that's where he stayed for 2 years. Now, Paul says that the whole palace guard knows, and all the rest, that my chains are really in Christ. I'm imprisoned by Rome, but my chains are in Christ Jesus. That is true. No, they needed to learn contentment, didn't they? They needed it. So now, 14, and most of the brethren in the Lord. This term brethren is a generic term, meaning both men and women. Now, most of the brethren in the Lord have become confident. So, are there any benefits now to what Paul is going through, what the brethren know, what they're aware of? And Paul says, yes, there is great benefit. And he says now that they have become more confident by my chains. Now think of the influence Paul was wielding. Paul was causing the brethren where? In Rome to become what? More confident, more bold in their what? Yeah, in their speaking, in their preaching, in their Christianity. So they were hearing, as Dale brought up, they were hearing of Paul and the saga and all the things. They would even have opportunity to do what? Go into Paul's rented house and to visit with him. And his chains made the brethren more confident in what they were doing. And so by saying they were becoming more confident, he says they were in a constant state. This was something that they just continuing. What does enthusiasm do? Okay, it's contagious. It spurs others on. Now, enthusiasm has that effect. But sadly, folks, what else has that effect? Yeah, pessimism, negativity, that also has its effect. And so Paul says, my chains, which the brethren were aware of, it is continually, constantly emboldening them, encouraging them. So his imprisonment was a source of great encouragement, and they are much more bold to speak. They were very daring. Their enthusiasm caused them to be bolder in their presentation. All right, Ben, then Dale.
Those that have to go with Jesse and Raul, don't you think they're a little bit more bold?
Oh, I think so.
Just watch their actions and their presentation and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not rocket science, but there is art to it.
Yeah. There is. There's an art, but it's not, like Ben brought up, it's not rocket science, because, one of the things that, we had the steps that were outlined and everything as to what we do. And so then one of the things that we were able to do with Raul and Jesse is we were able to see how that actually worked, how they talked to them, and then it's there. Would you like to know more about the Church of Christ? Just that simple. And yet, seeing it being done, yes, that is a great source of encouragement. All right, Dale?
Well, 2 things on what you're speaking of now. I'll say this. Yesterday, that I think Ben and Wesley did some yard work, and Sheriff and Mike finished the day with yard work. And Shep told me, he said, when he got home, he said, you know, you could see the change in people when they know that somebody cares.
Mm-hmm.
You can see it. So he said, he sort of goes along with what Neil was talking about. But on the other hand, then, when this situation, when people look at what Saul was, persecuted the church, and he was in prison, the Christians, and put him to death, did Stephen. Then they can see where Paul is at today, and he's in prison because not sort of the same thing. They were preaching, he imprisoned me.
Right.
He's preaching, he got in prison.
Right.
But the thought is that it's sort of come to light, bubble sort of busted, so to speak. And Paul is still doing what he set out to do as Paul.
Right. That's true. Yep. So now, as we think about Paul and his dealing with these, this assessment in the 14th verse, we notice that men and women, generic term, were in a constant state of speaking, becoming more and more confident. They became much more bold. They were very daring. They spoke with the mouth. And they did so without fear, no dread, no terror, no fear. And it was with the mouth, and they began to speak so much the more. So notice what Paul's example had done to the brethren there in Rome. When he showed up, you know, and as Dale brought up, you know, today something happens, what's the first thing we do to share that? Pull out those smartphones and we get on them, we send out a message, or we contact somebody, or we have our list of folks that we send messages out to, and that message just goes everywhere. How did it travel then? Word of mouth. Now, I don't know what all took place, but I know that Paul arrived in Rome, he got off the ship, and then somehow, some way, he found a place that he could live in. And it was a place wherein now the word spread. And all the while, he's what? Chained to a Roman soldier. Now, he could freely move about that house. He could receive guests. He could do a lot of things. But he was chained to a Roman soldier. But as some commentators have expressed, who was really chained? Paul or the soldier? Because every time Paul got the opportunity to preach the gospel in that house, who heard it? Yeah, and then who did he go tell it to? And so, who was really the captive? And Paul says now that my imprisonment has caused the spread of the gospel, and the brethren are much more bold. Now, in verse 15, he says, now some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. So we had two different groups, but who are they preaching? They're preaching Christ, but their motives are that which Paul identifies as being different. Some of them are doing it because of goodwill, and some because of envy and strife. The word envy carries with it a feeling of displeasure. A feeling of displeasure. Does envy look good on anyone? You can't make envy look pretty. It just, those things don't happen. And this feeling of displeasure, why do we become envious of folks? Okay, want whatever they have.
Not content.
Not content.
And David carries the idea, I don't want to do that.
Right.
Even if I can't ever have it, I don't want to do that.
So this envy now is because of someone's success in whatever area. In this particular context, what was the success that was motivating or causing their envy? conversions, the gospel being spread. And because of that now, these folks became some envious. And not only were they envious, but they were now full of strife. This means to be in contention or to see themselves as being rivals. So notice they were preaching Christ, but what was the motive? What was behind it? They wanted to either attain the same level of what? Notoriety that who had? Paul. They either wanted that or they wanted to do what to his notoriety? Diminish it. But what did Paul seek in all of this? Was Paul trying to put the spotlight on himself and say, look how great I am? Was that Paul's motive? Paul says, I want Christ in all things to be what? Glorified. That Paul was never the focus. He was never the one that attention was to be riveted on. That's not what he was seeking. But now there are those who, for some reason, did not appreciate what Paul was doing. And so envy and strife came up, but some also from goodwill. Now the former, they're going to preach Christ from selfish ambition. He gets a little more detail here. Not sincerely, but they are seeking, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed or set for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. Now, folks, what's the point of this when Paul says whether in pretense or in truth? What's his whole point? Christ is what? Christ is being preached. When Christ is preached, as we think about the gospel being preached and Christ being preached, what's going to happen? Are people going to have an opportunity to hear the gospel and obey it? And Paul says whether it's in pretense, whether their motives are right or not, or whether it's in truth, I rejoice. Because who's being preached? Christ. Now, he is not talking about a different doctrine. You remember in Galatians chapter 1, as he pronounces those woes upon those who would do what? Preach another doctrine, which is not the doctrine. So Paul's not talking about teaching a false doctrine or different doctrine. But what Paul is saying is they're preaching Christ. They're preaching truth. They're preaching the gospel. Now, what their motives are, I don't know. And what else might he say? I'm not concerned with their motive. Just so long as what? Christ is preached. Now, folks, there is something that preaching lends, and I'm going to say this, having done this for over 30 years, Brother Ken may or may not agree, preaching tends to promote arrogancy.
If we don't preach the truth, we slide from it. But if we preach the truth, it's going to cause division. It's going to cause, if people have to accept it or reject it.
Yeah.
And if it's not that, then we're not preaching the truth.
Well,
We're preaching something that doesn't do it good.
right. And I agree with that. But what my point is this whole thing, folks, I could stand up here for the next 15 years and preach truth, preach truth, preach truth. Preach the whole counsel of God. And yet at the same time, I could leave this earth. And could I miss heaven? if I'm not what? Whose attitude and whose demeanor, whose reason for preaching and all of that, how's that got to be? That's got to be controlled.
Well, I think this verse talks about this. He says, the former proclaimed Christ as a self-ambition.
And in every even in the brotherhood we have preachers, and I'm not going to even suggest any names, but it's the reality. We have preachers that are preaching for selfish ambition. Now, but then there are those that Paul would even say their motives may be totally improper, but they're preaching what? Truth. And when they're doing that, I will what? Rejoice. Now, there may be a whole different scenario with them and their relationship to God. But he says they're preaching truth. Paul dealt with them in the city of Rome. But he says there are those who are doing it of goodwill. They have a right attitude toward Paul. They're preaching the gospel. They're not seeking self-aggrandizement in any way. They're just preaching and teaching the truth. And Paul said, once again, I what? I rejoice because the gospel is being preached. And so Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. So as we think about Paul and his the context in which we're looking at here in verses 12 through 18, as he's talking about the preaching and teaching of the gospel and the fact that he was in chains, there were some great benefits to Paul being in chains. Yes, Brother Eric?
Teaching. Persevere in these things, as for you to do this will ensure salvation for both you, for yourself, and for those who hear you. So you can drift away and teach wrong. That's pretty straightforward right there.
Pretty straightforward. And I mean, and I can be in that category and still preach 100% true. But I'm not doing what to me? Keeping myself in the right frame of mind and the right disposition of heart and mind. And so when we think about Paul and his chains and the preaching of the gospel, the chains that Paul was chained with, they put him in contact with those who were lost. Christ became known. But a second thing is, Paul's chains provided courage to the saved. They became more what? Bold. And then the third thing is, Christ is magnified. That's one of the things that I'll just sort of throw out here for you as we're going to bring this to a close here in a few moments as the kiddos will be coming out. But Paul says in verse 20, if you notice that with me, he says that now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. So now, magnified. I think there's two aspects in which we need to look at this. What's the difference between a telescope and a microscope?
One sees far away, one sees very, very close.
But they both what? Magnify. And I think we as Christians need to be both. As a telescope, we need to have Christ magnified through our lives and our obedience so that Christ can be what? Seen. But then there's also the necessity that when we become Christians and as Christians, then there are those who are close, but they need to see Christ what? Magnified. And I think those are dual responsibilities that we as Christians have. Justin.
Going back to your point about not being puffed up or having self-gratification. Well, Christ said in Matthew 20:28, or start 27, whoever desires to be first among you, let him be a slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. So if we have that mind of being a servant, that won't allow us to be puffed up.
Nope.
Be self-gratification.
That's true. Very, very good point. But think about that, and particularly think about it as I encouraged you. We have names and contacts over there. You have an opportunity to be a what? Telescope. People who are far off get to see Jesus. And then, if we're fortunate enough to be able to have them come and to start visiting and everything, then they're closer, so we get a chance to have them what? As a microscope, Christ is magnified. And folks, I think that is our twofold dual responsibility, to be a telescope and to be a microscope. All right, so we'll pick up next Wednesday evening, or this coming Wednesday, and we'll pick up in verse number 19, and we'll continue through the first chapter. Thank you all for your good comments.